this edition of 2020 Daily Trail Markers, South Bend, Indiana Mayor Pete Buttigieg is narrowly leading the pack of Democratic presidential hopefuls in Iowa. That's according to the latest Monmouth University poll of the Iowa caucuses. Asked who they would support if the caucuses were held today, 22% said Buttigieg, 19% said Joe Biden, and 18% said Elizabeth Warren. The mayor's rise in the polls comes as a new group of supporters emerges. Barnstormers for Pete assembled in Iowa 2 weeks ago, where Buttigieg and other presidential hopefuls attended the Liberty and Justice celebration. The group is now planning other road trips in the hopes of boosting his chances in early states. For more on this, let's bring in Sarah Ewall-Wice. She's an associate producer in the CBS News political unit. All right, Sarah, give us a little background here. How and why were the Barnstormers for Pete born?
So it all started back in February when a woman named Kat Sosnick was sitting at her computer working from home, and she ended up clicking on an article about Mayor Pete Buttigieg, a South Bend, Indiana mayor who was considering a bid for the White House, and something about it she thought he was very authentic struck her. So she went and joined the One Lone grassroots group for him on Facebook and started interacting with other people who were interested in this mayor considering a presidential bid, and eventually ended up reaching out and asking administrators if she could be one of the administrators. And together, this group of people who were all communicating online started creating other groups. So they made Women for Pete Buttigieg, they made Republicans for Pete Buttigieg, African Americans for Pete Buttigieg, and they then came up with all 50 states for Pete Buttigieg and really spread the word. They also started having an event across the country, and she ended up hosting an event in New York with some other people that she'd met online, and they came out and they were talking, and she said, you know, someone invited me to the Iowa caucuses, one of the supporters online from Iowa, and she's like, I'm thinking of going. And another woman was like, you know what, that's like a great idea, but I actually think maybe we should go as a group to the Liberty and Justice celebration. The woman who suggested it had actually gone to the Jefferson Jackson dinner back in 2007 for President Obama. Then a candidate, and so she suggested they go, and they went online and sent out invites asking if people were interested to their entire group, and in 3 days they had 400 people that were interested. In 3 weeks they had 700 people, and mapped it out and found out it had people from almost every state, 49 of the 50 states. And then by the time they were about to head over to Iowa at the beginning of November, they had more than 1,000 people from all 50 states, D.C. and Puerto Rico, and they were driving from all across the country, as well as flying and really picking up each other along the way as they road trip to Iowa for this Liberty and Justice celebration.
So, yeah, the Barnstormers first assembled in Iowa. Where are they headed next, and how are they planning to win support for him?
So they thought they had such a great weekend in Iowa with their events that they held there. Granted, this was all not in coordination with the campaign. They did do some training with the campaign once they were there, but this was a separate grassroots group. And because they had so much fun and they loved it so much, they're now planning a trip in December to go to New Hampshire and do something very similar. They also want to go to the early states of South Carolina as well as Nevada before circling back to Iowa next February, where they want to be in the state for the Iowa caucuses. They're actually trying to recruit 300 vehicles to be in the state to help Iowa caucus goers get to the polls, or excuse me, get to their caucus locations.
So finally, Sarah, you are there in Louisiana ahead of this weekend's gubernatorial election. What is the latest on that race? What are you looking out for?
So it's looking like it'll be a very tight race here in Louisiana. This is a Democratic governor, the only Democratic governor in the Deep South, John Bel Edwards, and he's up against a businessman, Eddie Rispone. And Rispone has really aligned himself with President Trump, and President Trump has actually come to the state now 3 times to campaign and hold his rallies for the Republican candidate. A couple weeks ago, they had their primary, and of course, John Bel Edwards did not get 50%, which is why we're going to this runoff. But I spoke to Edwards' team, and they are pretty confident. They said they had a good early voting turnout, especially among African Americans. So it really comes out to who's going to turn out on Election Day. So these candidates are crisscrossing the state, really trying to get the vote out, and we will have to keep an eye on what their messaging is in the next 2 days before the election on Saturday.
All right, Sarah Ewall-Wice covering all angles for us. Sarah, thank you so much.
Of course.